Welcome to Earth, a Love Story. I'm your host, Robin Lassiter. If you listened to that last podcast episode and reached out to me, thank you. It's very kind. People were worried about me. I'm okay. I really am. This is how this goes and flows. And as soon as I spilled my guts here for the millionth time, a weight was lifted and I'm okay. It feels like I've integrated it on some level. And now I am actively exploring the golden frequency that I mentioned as well, which I think is just the evolution through joy training ramping up. And it's exciting. And I used to think that I could predict when these energies or the new paradigm or the new construct or whatever was going to be done moving through me, but I think I've learned better by now. It's unfolding, emerging, revealing itself, and I'm just along for the ride. I will say that this work that we're all doing, the work of remembering what it means to be human while simultaneously re-enchanting the world and visioning for a new, hopeful, and exciting future, works. The work works. We grow our capacity. We learn to feel our feelings, be with our animal bodies, and love all of our parts back home to ourselves. And in that process, we can hold more and more and more, and eventually life seems to be flowing through us rather than happening to us. Or that seems to be available more often, I'll say. Certainly not all the time. And I want to say as well to those of you who reached out in response to that last episode and said, me too, I hear you. There was a lot of you that reached out. I knew that there would be. I know that this is something that really wants to be talked about, and people talk about it. You know, Whitley Strieber's been carrying this torch for a really long time. Many experiencers talk about this stuff, and for whatever reason, it just seems like the moment has arrived for me to speak more publicly about it. And so I hear you. It's rough to carry these things alone. This will not be the last time that I visit the subject of sex and the phenomenon. And for what it's worth, I have been sensing for a while, maybe 6 or 8 months, that as we've been learning somatic skills to hold and be with our bodies as they process the past and come into the present, and as we integrate our emotional bodies and do a lot of shadow work, like that's coming too. I'm going to talk a lot about shadow work. The next body that's arriving to be integrated is the sexual body. Like it's coming, you guys. And I think it has to do with evolution through joy and creativity. And why wouldn't it? This life force energy. So I'm not ready to tackle any of that yet, but it will again unfold as we trust what the mystery is co-creating with and through us. And another thing that really wants to come through, another aspect, and I've talked about it a little bit, but not a lot, is the goddess, the feminine, the things that, you know, the part of ourselves that we've pushed down into the underworld, and how necessary it is that we retrieve her, especially at this time on the planet, and what she has to do with UFOs, like what the feminine, not women, but what the feminine energy, the feminine force has to do with UFOs. I think it's really important, and that episode has been writing itself in my head for a few weeks now, and I'm really excited to dive into that and to get it out for you guys. So stay tuned for that. And I hope you're doing well. I hope you're okay. Okay, guess what? Jeffrey J Kripal, you know him, you love him, is on this episode of Earth, a Love Story. Jeff, if you don't know who he is, get ready to be excited. He's such a wonderful resource and a thought leader in this field. Jeff holds the J. Newton Rayzor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University in Houston. He worked with Rice's Special Collections Director to create and host the Archives of the Impossible, which is a collection of accounts detailing the supernatural, including thousands of first-hand abduction accounts, many in the form of handwritten letters to Whitley Strieber which Anne Strieber collected. And if she hadn't done that, we wouldn't have these. So tremendous gratitude for Whitley and Anne Strieber. The archives include once highly classified government remote viewing files and other examples of the strange and anomalous, and it's become one of the largest and most significant collections of research materials related to these marginalized and tabooed topics in the world. Jeff also organized the Archives of the Impossible conferences that you've heard me speak about. He's the author of over a dozen books, including Authors of the Impossible, The Paranormal and the Sacred, Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religion, Kali's Child, The Mystical and the Erotic in the Life and Teachings of Ramakrishna, and The Flip, Epiphanies of Mind and the Future of Knowledge. His present areas of writing and research include the articulation of a new comparativism within the study of religion that will put the impossible back on the table again, a robust and even conversation between the sciences and the humanities, and the mapping of an emergent mythology, or super story, within paranormal communities and individual visionaries. Jeff's new book, How to Think Impossibly, about souls, UFOs, time, belief, and everything else, is out now. And through my own personal lens, there have been a few really pivotal interactions with Jeff's work which have informed my own journey and work. First, I know you've heard me say this, but Jeff is the one who said, in reference to experiencer accounts, if you haven't heard about the trauma or the sex, you haven't heard the whole story. And second, I heard him say, and it stuck with me and has become so central to who I am and what I do. He said, we need to tell better and better stories so that we can have better and better experiences. We essentially control our future and our children's children's future. We can constantly make a different movie that we then exist in and experience ourselves in. Which, you guys, I think he's talking about evolution through creativity. I hope that you enjoy my conversation with the one, the only, Jeffrey J Kripal. What you put into the world is, to me, just helping people bridge this rational materialist world that we live in and this other world that has always existed, but we've kind of forgotten about. And it's important. I think it's really important right now.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one works where one is. And people ask me to do X, Y, and Z. I'm like, yeah, I can't do that. I'm gonna stay in my lane, and I'm gonna just keep poking the bear. And you do what you can do, and you don't do what you can't do. So
I'm taking that advice in because I always want to do all the things. So yeah.
Well, I mean, the experiencer community is really important here, and they haven't been listened to, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
As you know better than I do. I mean, that's what's dismissed, is that experiential dimension, which is really the whole human dimension. I mean, it's like it's not tangential.
Right. Yeah. When I was shopping my book around, I ultimately just self-published it, but I sent it to publishers, and my very first rejection and my very favorite rejection was somebody who said, you are not qualified to tell your own story, that it needs to be run, experiencer stories need to be run through a third party expert, and they can tell your story. And I was like, oh my God, you just said it. You admitted out loud that, and it's horrendous. And I can't believe you said it, but I loved that rejection for that reason. Like, wow, we're not allowed to tell our stories.
Yeah. Yeah, because and the third person expert, of course, will reduce it or explain it away.
Right.
And in general, not always, but certainly in general.
Right. Not keep the impossibility of it, the paradox, all the things that drive us to figure out what the hell's going on, which is the gold and the struggle.
I mean, of course, there's some insight in that the experiencer isn't necessarily the authority of the experience, but neither is the third person. That's just crazy. That's like nutty to me. It's like, no, that's not right. Just that. No.
Can you say more about that? The experiencer isn't also necessarily the what did you say, expert of the experience?
Yeah. I mean, so for example, are we talking now? Are
I mean,
we
usually I just kind of start talking and then we get
okay?
into
That's
it.
fine.
So yeah, it's a
I'm totally fine with that.
conversation and yeah,
I'm
if
totally
you're
fine
okay.
with that.
Okay.
What I mean by that is, I actually get in trouble for saying this, but when experiencers tell me their experiences, they want me to sign my name to how it's displayed or how it appears or whatever the experience is. And I'm like, I can't do that because if I sign my name to your version of the afterlife or your version of reality, it means I can't sign my name to anyone else's. It means I can't take anybody's experience seriously except yours.
Right.
And so I think what experiences do is they force us back into a kind of comparative perspective, and they force the question, okay, what's going on in all these experiences? And that also forces us into a kind of non-literal approach to experience, by which I don't mean it's not metaphysical or it's not ontological or it doesn't have anything to do with reality. I'm not saying that. But reality appears to individuals through this medium that we lamely call the imagination or
Mm.
vision or whatever we call it. And so it's not a when I say experiencers aren't their own authority, I don't mean that in a reductive way. I don't mean I'm the authority. I
Hmm.
mean none of us are. And it's all appearing and it's all showing itself, but it's doing that in a way that um, I think it's the only way it can appear to us, to be honest. Um, so that's what I mean by that.
Yeah, I love that. I spent most of my life alone with these things, and the best community or like the closest that I found was kind of the new age, star seed, that kind
Yeah,
of thing, which always felt like, which I
yeah.
engaged with, but ended up being kind of a like think yourself rich trauma response, it wasn't the thing. And then um when I started having lots of experiences and kind of became reactivated in early 2020, who I found was Stuart Davis.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
And I'm so grateful for that because he helped me contextualize it in the way that you're talking about. It became a developmental driver rather than collapsing it down into these either or certainties. And it's harder, you
Well,
know?
so I just wrote a book. Like obviously I write books. That's what I do. And it's called How to Think Impossibly. And Stewart's experience is very much a part of
Mhm.
that book. And it's that third space that I'm really trying to talk about. It's like, what do we do if we don't just believe everything? And what do we do if we don't reduce or explain everything? What is that other space? And how do we talk about it? And so that's how to think impossibly is to sit in that space, to sit in
Mhm.
that middle. And you know, if I could also speak autobiographically, this is going to sound old fashioned, but back in the 80s, when I was a kid from Nebraska, by the way, I just was just a kid. I literally grew up in a hardware store, Robin. I didn't know anything. I mean, come on. I was just a kid. And I went to a Catholic seminary and I learned about this German thinker named Sigmund Freud. And I learned about this thing called the unconscious. And it just blew my mind. And the reason it blew my mind is because of this the experiencer is not his or her own authority. There's something else going on that is deeper than what the conscious ego or the self thinks is going on. And of course, I applied that to myself, and I applied that to everyone around me, and I applied that to all the seminarians, and it worked, and it still works. I mean, we don't call it the unconscious. We don't. I try not to be Freudian. I try not to be literal minded, like in a psychoanalytic sense, but that feeling that there's some kind of force or presence that is not showing itself to us, I think is very powerful and pretty obvious if you really listen to people.
Yeah. Obvious if you listen to people. And for me, there was, even after a lifetime of experiences, there was this deconditioning from consensus reality
Yeah.
because it's so dismissed. And so once that process happened, then it's like, this entire other landscape opens up. which is ontological. It's the unconscious, the subconscious, archetypal. I don't know what it is, but it exists in all of those places and throughout all states of consciousness. And it refuses to be pinned down. I mean, for me, I needed magic, and I needed that to make life worth living, because otherwise it was always so confusing. It was more confusing if it didn't exist. It's like, what the hell are we all doing here?
Well, it's
So
boring. It's
it's boring.
depressing.
That's right.
I mean, it's like I think the consensus reality, I think the move that people want to make is that these experiences are mental, they're hallucinations or they're psychological and they don't have anything to do with physical reality. But of course they do. And I think what's so shocking or what's so problematic to the consensus reality is that there isn't a clear division between what goes on in the human subject and what goes on in the objective world. It's not clean. And I think we don't have a way of thinking about that because all of our thoughts and all of our beliefs and assumptions are that they're completely separate and they have nothing to do with one another. And what goes on inside us is unreal, and what goes on outside us is real. I mean, that's really the assumption, and I just don't think that's true.
Right. And then when something real happens in the real world, then it shatters that. And when something, so yeah, that's why I get a little worried about movements, about like things that come into the culture and then become eaten by the world, and just become part of the machine of the world that is rational materialism, because we can do that. Like, that's what we're really good at. We do that all the time. It seems that this is the one place that defies that. And that's my hope, is that even as it comes more into the collective and people do listen more to experiencers, or they do think about how to think impossibly and explore this space, that it doesn't get eaten and assimilated.
Yeah, that's why, of course, I stay in the academy, and that's why I do this, and because I want to poke that bear.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not as if the academy is the only influence here. That's not true at all, but it's one of the influences.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is we train, millions of young people every year, and so it has a tremendous influence. And if you can affect that influencer, you can influence the one influencer.
Mm-hmm.
There are other influences that are really important, but I don't have access to them, and we don't have access to them. So, again, you do what you can do. But I think you're right. I'm sure you're right. That consensus reality. It eats all of this. The move is to reduce it all to either society or nature. And what happens when those two moves don't work? Well, you're
Yeah.
just all crazy.
Right.
I mean, that's the other. Of course, so that's just a reduction to nature again. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, this is just a psychopathology. This is something going on. This is chemical, or this is something that has to do with the person, not reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know how you feel about this, but I wonder if you'd be willing to talk about some of your experiences that brought you to this thinking. Like, I know I've heard you talk about it in other places, mostly, Stuart, that's how I discovered you.
Uh-huh.
And I have to say as well, while I have a chance just to shove this in here, that him quoting things to me that you said
Hmm.
was a really important part of my journey, particularly around trauma and sex.
Hmm.
And, I think I went to him with a story about that I'm just like deciding to talk about. I've never talked about, which is the experience of retrieval of genetic material, which lots of experiencers have had. It's another thing that defies all of the
Yeah.
things. It does seem to be both physical and in this other space. I don't know what to do with it. I have had that experience, and I very like panicky and full of sweat went to him and confessed, that this had happened. And he said back to me, Jeff Kripal says that if you haven't yet heard about the trauma or the sex part of it, you haven't heard the whole story. And there are just these like moments of hearing something that clicked me into a framework that saved me and helped me. So thank
Good.
you for that through the third party, Stuart. Yeah.
I do think it's therapeutic to use a banal word to know you're not alone,
Mm-hmm.
and that these experiences are actually have long, long histories. Um, they get interpreted in different ways, of course. I mean, unfortunately, your experience of genetic material and sexuality and abduction of some kind usually is interpreted demonically in the history of Western Christianity. I think that's a terrible mistake. Um, but that's the go-to historically for these kinds of experiences, and you still see it in our culture. People still want to invoke their belief system. This is why I'm so suspicious of belief systems, Robin. It's like, oh my God, don't do that. That is so wrong. Because it's traumatic enough to begin with, and you don't need trauma on top of the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I no, I'm not afraid of telling you where I came from. My fear is always I've already told this story so many times and you've heard it, and I don't want to repeat myself, but it's um, the short answer, well, there's the short answer and there's a long answer. The longer answer involves an experience I had in 1989 in Calcutta that made me deeply sympathetic to these experiences. Um, Basically, I was living in Calcutta, and I was writing about Shakti Tantra, as a historian, and so I was very comfortable with South Asian Bengali categories around Shakti and Kundalini and Tantra and all this stuff, but from a very grounded textual and cultural perspective. I wasn't just talking out my head.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I had this essentially this awakening, this sort of subtle energy awakening that happened one night when I was asleep, and it involved an out of body experience and involved a download, as we would say later. There were no downloads, by the way, in 1989, but it was very much some kind of transmission, and I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know afterwards what had happened. Again, I wasn't an authority of my own experience. I was like, what the fuck was that? That was extraordinary, but it was really confusing. And over the decades, I it was somewhere in the back of my mind for sure. It's certainly retreated. I didn't have that experience again ever. Um, But when I started to talk to people, I was writing a book on the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. And when I started to talk to all these people, hundreds of people, Robin, hundreds, they were telling me just crazy stories. And I was like, oh, that's like what happened to me in Calcutta in 1989. So it gave me this. It wasn't like it was that. It wasn't. There wasn't an identity there, but it gave me a kind of deep sympathy to these experiences. And I realized also this was about oh 05, oh 06, somewhere in there. I realized that historians and scholars of religion had nothing. They they didn't know how to deal with these experiences. They would always reduce them to some kind of power or knowledge system or social function or psychological need. And I was like, that just doesn't work. That's just not right. I mean, it's true. I mean, all those things happen, yes, but it doesn't really capture what's going on. And so I became adamant about this around 2010. I wrote a book called Authors of the Impossible, and I just started to go into universities and go into podcasts and just talk openly about it. And my sense of it is, after hundreds of these, by the way, hundreds of universities and hundreds of podcasts, is that people are quite open to it, even if they don't want to talk about it. That's what I realized, is that historians and even physicists and philosophers of science, historians of science, they're like really open about it and really interested, but they don't want to sound like the tabloids.
Hmm.
And so they're okay with me coming in and talking about it, but they themselves probably won't talk about it. And so I realized what I realized through that experience of like almost 20 years now is wow, there's a lot of support for this, but it's kind of under the cover or behind the curtains. And I still think that actually. I still think that people in general are very supportive, but don't have a vocabulary or a way of talking about it. So that's really what I said about trying to do and encouraging other colleagues to do that. It's not, this isn't just a Jeff show. It's like there's like hundreds of people like me in the academy trying to do this now. And that's what you saw at the art at the conference. You saw 26 of them. But there are hundreds, Robin. There are hundreds of us. And that doesn't sound like many, but when you think of each of those people trains thousands of people, I mean, it starts to add up, and you start to realize, oh, there's something going on that is really significant. So that's how I got into it. And yeah, I'll just tell you a story that just happened. It just happened yesterday, actually. I just did another podcast with Michael Shermer. Do you know who Michael Shermer is?
I do not. Mm-mm.
He Michael's kind of the creme de la creme of skeptics.
Mm.
He edits a magazine called the Skeptics magazine, and he writes for Scientific American. And but he's not Michael is not dismissive. He's just really thoughtful, and he certainly takes a materialist perspective, but it's really honest and open, and he can articulate it really well. And where I'm going with this is he was really thoughtful with me, and he was wanted to know too. He wanted to really listen, and he wanted to know how I thought about things. And I just found him, as I've often read him, really sophisticated about it. And I think we have to talk to those people as well, because their skepticism is not coming always from a place of meanness or disinformation. Is coming from a place of honesty and integrity. And I think why no, we have to address that as well, because that's where people are too. So I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say other than I think that this is part of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. As you're talking, this kind of vision or something is forming in my head about the phenomenon in general, which remains and ever has been throughout, I think, human history, like slippery and in the shadows and not in what I call the overculture. Even in cultures that it is more integrated and accepted, it still is in the fringes, in the edges. And I'm wondering what it looks like as our culture kind of may be influenced by all these people who are influencing, as you're saying, and it comes more into our culture. Is it ever going to be central? I think it has to remain on the edges. What do you think about that?
So I also think we have to be um, not easy. We have to be sympathetic with ourselves.
Mm.
And we have to acknowledge, I think, that the phenomenon itself is deceptive.
Right.
It's not that human beings are fucking with us. It's that something's fucking with us.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes really literally. And I think what we have to let go of is our sense of moral outrage and our sense of agency. And we also have to let go of this notion that we're somehow on the top of things, we're somehow in control. I don't think we are, actually. Um, but we also have to recognize that it's also trying to engage us. It's not like bad or sinister, but
Hmm.
it's not like it's good or holy. It's like, come on, this is really complicated. And so one of the reasons I'm so adamant about paranormal phenomena is it's trying to freaking talk to us. It's trying to communicate. So I'm like, come on, respond. Don't dismiss this or go on with your day or say it's normal. It's not normal. The paranormal is not normal.
Hmm.
It's weird for a reason. It's trying to get our attention. So pay attention. And I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how we respond to it, but I think we have to respond to it. So I think something like what Stuart's doing or what you're doing, I think is really important. But I think Stuart would be the first to say, I'm not really sure what I'm doing. I mean, that's the role of humor here, by the way. It's like really humor for me is a kind of stepping out of one's worldview and making fun of it. And I think that's really important. And the phenomenon itself is funny, by the way. It's absurd.
Hmm.
Um, so let's acknowledge that. And I think that takes us off the hook in some ways. Because I think we should be taken off the hook. I don't think it's not our fault.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm feeling in me these kind of warring parts, which is, one part of me is very much surrendered to the liminality and the paradox and the sitting in the unknown. Like that's how I've survived this. That's the move, that is the most helpful and
Yeah.
effective. And there's another part of me that's like, yeah, but what the fuck? Like, but what is it? What let's do something. What does it mean? What does it do? And so I'm aware of that. I'm aware of both of those parts. I always end up back in the unknown because that's where it pushes me. There's no other place really to go. There's nothing else to do. But I feel it in me that I want to categorize it. I want to put it into something that makes sense. And as soon as I do, the beauty of it is that it blows that up anyway.
Yeah, people often want me to tell them what's going on.
Yeah. What's going on, Jeff? Come on.
I don't know. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
That's the point. So let's have the conversation. Let's create the culture and the art and ask the questions.
Hmm. That's right. That creating the culture and the art.
Well, that's why I love Stewart's Aliens and Artists. I think that's exactly the right response.
Hmm.
I think the wrong response is it real or not real?
Right.
It's like this up or down vote. I'm like, oh God, that is not what's going on. That's that is not the point.
Right. Right. And if it was, how boring again. Something in me wants this, of course, to be completely unsolvable. And something in me wants it to be solved.
Yeah, well, that's the two parts of Robin. That's the
Right.
two parts of all of us. Come on,
Yeah, yeah.
the way this is voiced a lot is where's the smoking gun? And my
Hmm.
reply is always, there's no smoking gun. That's the point.
Right.
That's the whole point. And they're like, what? And because they want to them, I think physical smoking gun equals real,
Hmm.
equals we solved it. And I'm like, no, you're not going to solve this one.
Hmm.
Sorry.
Right.
Um,
Which is the best, which is great.
well, is it?
Mm.
I don't know. Yeah, I just don't know. I just like, but I think that's the truth. That's true. That's the case. This,
Yeah.
this again, why I love humor is like, yeah, but it acknowledges that. It
Hmm.
says you're not going to figure this out.
Yeah. Yeah, just all the ways that I so want it to be something, just want it to be
There's
something
this
now.
there's
Yeah.
this really funny scene in my new book where it involves Mitch Hedberg, by the way, who's a
Mm,
professional comedian, and I'm trying to talk about what one of my colleagues calls the tyranny of clarity.
mm,
The enlightenment or rationalist impulse to have the smoking gun.
hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, but maybe UFO photos or photos of Bigfoot are fuzzy or out of focus for a reason.
Right.
Maybe that's part of what's being communicated. And Hedberg has this hilarious stand-up where he's like, yeah, one of the most terrifying things about Bigfoot is that he's always out of focus. There's like an out of focus monster roaming the American countryside. And he says that's truly terrifying. And of course he's laughing about it. And I'm like, yeah, that's it. That's the correct observation. And that the fuzziness somehow is part of the phenomenon.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, I think we solved it really. I don't know where we go from here, but
No, we didn't.
no, we didn't. That's the we didn't solve it is the solving it. Yeah.
Tell me,
Mhm.
Robin, tell me not to turn the tables on you, but
Yeah.
tell me how you got into all this, because I have not read your book, by the way. I have your book sitting here, but I have not read it.
You,
It's like one of 100 books I haven't
yeah.
read.
You did read my book actually, because you wrote a very beautiful thing for the back, and maybe you skimmed it, but
That means I skimmed it. That does
yeah,
not mean I read it thoroughly.
yeah.
So I
Uh,
know something about your history, but I don't know the history.
yeah. Um, well, just a lifelong experiencer. So early out of body experiences, a lot of strange things that I didn't know were strange at a, starting at a young age. And then being highly sensitive and growing up in the middle of nowhere and trying to then integrate into the world, which made absolutely, no sense to me. And so I'm 8 years sober yesterday, but that was part of it as well. Just like, this world is too fast and bright, and how can I turn it all down? And so addiction is a big part of my story. And um yeah, just a lifetime of mystical and shattering experiences with no context and no place to put them and nowhere to talk about them and no answers. And then in 2019, 2020, somewhere in there, the sort of UFO or alien, whatever that means. People can't see, but I'm
Yeah.
doing air quotes because whatever that is. But that kind of
Mhm.
flavor of things came in. And then I discovered Stuart and the Experiencer Group, and this context and framework, and this kind of what feels to me like this burgeoning culture where all of these things can be talked about and there's context for them. And it gave me a ground, which is the never being grounded, like the ever shifting sands of the liminal. But it gave me a space to think about and engage with this stuff. And I became a member of the Experiencer Group, and now I'm its community manager. And it's just like I met my people. I just met all my people. It's like, oh, there you all are. I'm,
You have your tribe, as we say.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Do you find the UFO thing frustrating though? I mean, because the public conversation around it is very nuts and bolts.
yeah, I think I am lucky because I didn't know that ufology existed I until 2020 or whatever. So um so my landscape is this, what we're talking about. I didn't really know about nuts and bolts stuff. I didn't, now I can see it, it's happening. But I again I'm coming from this context and framework. So to me, it's like, oh, they just haven't caught up yet. They haven't looked around the corner and seen the weird thing that accompanies all of this, but they will, because that's what's actually there. So I don't know. I'm not frustrated by it. It just seems like an old conversation that hasn't quite caught up yet. How do you feel about it?
Well, I mean, that's what I'm always trying to say to them. The they do know about it.
Mm,
I mean, it's sort of obvious to anybody who looks into the phenomena for more than like 2 seconds.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's really obvious, but it's a problem. It's a problem for politicians and for military people and for scientists who who are practicing scientists. So I think but to me, it's fascinating. This sort of paranormal aspect of the phenomena is certainly obvious, but so is the technological or physical aspect. And I think that just shatters, our worldview right there.
Mhm.
That both are true. Um,
And what can they do with it? What's their move if it's a reality shattering uh context, what is their move? They can't, I think in those contexts, they really want to put a stamp on it and be above it, as you say, like, and they can't.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is where the experiencer community comes in. I mean, I think that's the element of it that, I mean, again, it has been addressed. I mean, there are scientists who have been really honest and open about this, and um, but they're still not heard, I think, enough in the scientific community. But they're there. They're
Mm.
there. The answer, of course, is to change one's worldview. But
Right.
that's a tough sell,
Hmm.
you know,
I
particularly
don't.
when you need grants or you need money or you need promotion or which of course all of these scientists do. And
Mhm.
that's why I joke, I'm just a professor of religion. I don't know anything. And there's no money involved for the most part. There's a little actually, but it tends to come from private donors and people who are already invested in this. So
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, there's it's the question that has been talked about again and again, like if they landed on the White House lawn, it actually wouldn't make much of a difference because the process of changing the worldview inside of ourselves is um
well,
it takes
yeah,
as long as it takes. And yeah.
there's actually a long discussion in the new book about why they don't land,
Mm.
including why they don't land on the White House lawn. And there's lots of the different answers to that, but they basically involve what you just said. I mean, you, that's just a materialist fantasy that they're going
Yeah.
to land. And why would they land? Why? Again, it's so humanist. It's like the U.S. is the president's the king of the world. I mean, come on. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so the whole idea of landing on the White House lawn is just a mistaken materialist fantasy that doesn't speak to this spiritual dimension at all.
Yeah. I guess I want to ask if, you know, taking in the state of the world as it is, all the challenges that we're facing, like in the US, our political landscape, all of these things. I think one of the things I know nothing about anything, right? Like this is my little theory that I've cobbled together is that one reason why the political right is so successful is because they have a really compelling story. And it's not nuanced. It's just telling this really compelling story about good and evil and a way to win and a way to lose. And the left
Mhm.
doesn't do that. And so a lot of what I think about is, and I'm actually, taking out the extremes of the either or in this case as well, but recognizing that like we're facing something that, modern that us in modernity haven't faced. Uh, I think a lot about what kind of story we need to tell to
So do I.
come through this
So do
this
I.
uh whatever is going to unfold and how we make it to the other side. And I think it's going to be story that gets us there. So I would
I
love to
do too.
hear if you have a story to tell us. Fix
I,
it for us, Jeff.
it's very much about narrative. It's about controlling the narrative. It's
Mm-hmm.
about it's about the story. Um, the story on the right is fear-based,
Mm-hmm.
and it's either or. And I know from the study of religion that's very popular, by the way. That's what we call fundamentalism. And the power of fundamentalism is that it involves certainty and it builds high walls and thick walls. And what I always tell my students is, look, if your job is to create a church in a big parking lot, you want to be a fundamentalist. But if your job is to be the mayor of a city and to run a city, it it's bad. Fundamentalist communities are really quite awful when it comes to getting along with other people. And so it's a matter of scale, I think, Robin. If you're worried about your community or your little church or whatever it is, fundamentalism is great. Go for it. It works, but it doesn't work on a state level or city level or much less a national or global level. It's really problematic to 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 be really to underestimate the situation. And so I think we need a new story. Of course, I agree with you. I think we need a new story, but it needs to be a story that is about the whole community, and not just one part of it. And it needs to be about all people, of all genders and sexualities and races and ethnicities and religions, frankly. So we somehow need to move up. We need to raise up above what I call the chessboard, where somebody always wins and somebody always loses. And we need to move up and ask the question, well, maybe we need a new game.
Mm.
Why do we want to play that game? Someone wins and someone loses. That isn't a very good game. But there is something about the human being that is you know, up or down
Mhm.
and wants those high walls. So I think we have to recognize that and be again a bit compassionate with ourselves. Um, but half of this country is not that.
Mhm.
I mean, it just spins on a little dime, right? It's just a few 100,000 people here or there. So I think it can change. And I know my work with young people in the classroom, they're so fed up with
Mhm.
this old world. I mean, they're just over it. And so I do think it's a generational shift. I'm not sure my generation will see this, but I think future generations will see a dramatic shift in the culture and in the story we tell. Um, Having said that, I do think also, I mean, this is where I get worried. I wrote a book on the counterculture and the California counterculture, which very much changed the story, by the way.
Mm.
And then there was a backlash against that story, and we're sort of in the backlash right now. But one of the geniuses of the counterculture was that it was a youth culture that teamed up with elders and particularly intellectuals who had been saying the same things for decades. And suddenly here was this youth culture that like embraced them and held them up. And so you don't get the counterculture without the intellectuals, but you also don't get the counterculture without the young people. And so I think it's this intergenerational magic that happens. And as an educator, I do worry about the youth culture. It's so obsessed with digital technology and quick fixes. I don't think there are quick fixes, and I think ideas matter, and I think books matter, and I think elders, frankly, matter.
Mhm.
But I also think young people really matter. So I think it's a combination of things, that have to come together. Um, my other worry is that people like myself, academics, do have a story, but it's essentially depressing, essentially bad. And we need to come up with a story that is faithful to what we actually think about the world, but is also ultimately positive. Um, and I think that's a challenge.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder, this may go without saying, but where, all of your work is about bringing the impossible into the
Yeah,
story.
yeah.
And that seems to be something that we're thirsty for and we really, really need.
I think that's it. I think
Yeah.
that's I mean, personally, I think that's the secret. And my joke, the joke I often tell is last Halloween there were hundreds of kids who showed up at my door, and half of them were dressed up as superhumans, and nobody was dressed up as a professor of religious study. I'm like, that what does that mean? That means something. Come on, let's go with that. Let's talk about the superhumanities and superhumans and the impossible, and let's not talk about the things we've talked about, and because they're not reaching people, they're not winning hearts and minds.
Well, thank you for your time and thank you for your work. And I think that you know this, but in case you don't, you have a tremendous impact on me and my community. And we listen and we take it in and we struggle and wrestle with thinking impossibly and coming to this middle space where there are no answers. And And it's important. And it's, even if for one single person, like you said, just not to feel alone and have some sort of context and framework to move through the world, through this very challenging world that is mired in consensus reality and materialism, to have this other view and opening. It's here and you're doing it, and we're grateful. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Robin. I mean, I get goosebumps listening to you. I mean that. And it's totally mutual, by the way. I don't, one of the things I play with in this new book is called Thinking With, and I use a hyphen.
Mm.
And I mean it. I mean, it's like, no, experiencers are the key to this, but they're not sufficient either. I, I'm not sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
I need experience. I mean, people ask me all the time, well, what about your experiences? I'm like, I don't have any experiences, and I actually don't care. I'm not even that interesting. The experiencers are having experiences though. They're like, let's think with them. Let's do this together. And I really mean that. I mean that together. I don't mean one or the other. I think we're, as academics, completely insufficient. Um, but I suspect experiences are insufficient too. I think we need each other. So
Yeah, I really love that. I had what has been happening for me experientially over the past few years is this sense of what I call a we space, that
yeah,
my sense of individuality is kind of softening and opening, and I'm feeling this connection with a community and a collective that I did not feel previously, and that gives me tremendous hope. And I think it's what you're talking about. So
it is what I'm talking about.
yeah,
It's a sociology of the impossible, as I call it. It's that we space. It's not about an individual.
yeah, I love it. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thanks so much to Morgan Jenks for our musical soundscapes. Also, some quick housekeeping stuff. I'm putting together an audiobook of Earth, a Love Story, which you can purchase from me if you so desire. I'm quite excited about that. I'm going to continue to make it available on this podcast. The first 15 episodes are going to be me reading my book. It's going to stay that way, but I have compiled it and I'm turning it into an audiobook that people can buy from me, and there can be an energy exchange for that. So very excited about that, and excited to keep it as a free resource for people. One of the craziest confirmations of all of the weird experiences that I've had throughout my entire life is that the beings told me that this book would bridge the gap between these two big blocks of my life. And I'm amazed over and over and over again that that's exactly what it has done. It is me, it's mine, and it is also an entirely separate entity that's just out there in the world doing its thing. And I don't want to stop that from happening. So both and. So keep an eye out for that, as well as a new community and course that is forming and will be opening this fall. It's still percolating, but definitely wants to come through. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up to be on the waiting list. The Bridge Collective, by the way, so beautiful, going strong, amazing human beings. We're having a really great time, feeling our feelings, which is horrible, but it's good. It's really, really good. I'm so grateful for all of them. And this will be a new community that I will be forming and inviting people into. So sign up by going to my website if you'd like to be on that waiting list. We already have a few people ready to go there. Also, I will be releasing some step-by-step guides around some of the core pieces of this work. Things like basic protection practices, how to connect with your unseen team, some broad experiencer frameworks that I have found really helpful, how to integrate the sacred interior landscape, and more. I'm going to have as much of this for free as I can, and there will also be some courses and things that you can purchase through my website. And finally, eventually, I will be changing my website up. I'm going to be moving from honeyheart.org to earthalovestory.com and robinlassiter.com. So you're going to have to get used to me saying something new at the end of each podcast episode. But for now, if you would like to book a one-on-one session with me, it remains honeyheart.org.